Hey there folks, the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new The Dare record, What's Wrong with New York? A question that people have been asking since the beginning of time, yet one that we may never truly have the answer to. When Harrison Patrick Smith, aka The Dare, released his debut EP, The Sex EP, in 2023, I was somewhat of an apologist towards it. I mean, I never found myself particularly captivated by that EP's over-the-top crassness or anything, but at the same time, I never really found it to be the especially grating series of auditory torture devices that so many people seemingly did at the time. It just felt like Smith was bound for pure mediocrity if he kept going in the same direction that he did on his debut EP, and that was the exact kind of thing that showed the makings of an artist that I honestly didn't really have any plan to give a second look in the future. However, upon the release of his first full-length studio album, his latest project, What's Wrong with New York, I decided to give him a second listen, maybe see if he had developed his style a little bit, maybe gone in more of a dance punk direction, maybe gone in a more electronic direction. And I have to say that out of all of the decisions that I've made in my lifetime relating to the music that I listen to, this was certainly one of them. Not only is What's Wrong with New York a significantly worse listening experience than the Sex EP ever was last year, it's also giving me proper understanding as to why so many people have been flaming the Dare's work in the first place. I can truly see why people hated the Sex EP if they heard in that what I hear on this record. I mean, for the most obvious comparison out of the way, straight off of the bat, What's Wrong with New York? It feels like the most shameless LCD sound system worship that a person can possibly achieve, and that specific influence is so obvious that I'm almost inclined to believe in a conspiracy theory I've developed for myself that the track Movement's title is a reference to the song of the same name on LCD Sound System's self-titled studio album nearly 2 decades ago. I'm that deep in the rabbit hole at this point. This album sounds like a complete and total dollar store budget version of early LCD Sound System, but with a little later LCD Sound System mixed in just to, spice things up a bit. But look, all jokes aside, I personally don't find that to be a particularly bad thing, in concept at least. LCD Sound System are one of my favorite bands, first off, so hearing a band that sounds like them, I'm not totally against it. From the perspective of artistic uniqueness, I'm not totally for it, but I'm not going to complain if a band sounds like a band that I love. That's not really something that's on my list of complaints on a day-to-day basis. But also beyond that, LCD Sound System are a band that have been very obviously, over the course of their career, based around ripping off their influences and trying to do new things with those pre-existing ideas, or at the very least, adding a new youthful energy from a different generation to those ideas. I mean, complaining that The Dare sounds too much like LCD Sound System is like complaining that LCD Sound System, especially their early work, which is what this EP harps on a lot, sounds too much like Liquid Liquid or Sexual Harassment. Two statements that are completely and totally true. These are two bands, two projects that sound exactly like their influences, but whereas LCD Sound System, it's something that just happens to be an attribute of their greatness, for The Dare, it just feels kind of pathetic at times. Where Smith truly falters in comparison to his predecessors is that he lacks any of the real charm or charisma that makes this sort of new rave sound work when it indulges in as much of the archetypal sex, drugs, and rock and roll as much as this record does. I mean, there are a moment or two here where things veer into the realm of mildly fun camp. In particular, I don't think anybody could really take the track Girls seriously, that song being maybe the best track off of the Sex EP from last year. But then you have other tracks like Perfume, for example, that feel like obnoxious frat boy meets indie dork tunes that need a serious increase in self-awareness to have any sort of personality that extends beyond extraordinarily annoying. And that is, again, something that can be massively chalked up to the way that Smith presents himself behind the mic as The Dare. It has been said countless times by The Dare's detractors over the last year or so, but it cannot be stated enough how much Smith rips up on the vocal style of LCD Sound System's James Murphy. If you told me that half this album's track list was just demo versions of, like, Drunk Girls from This Is Happening, I would 100% believe you. But even in the brief moments where he tries to come across as a somewhat more tender individual, namely on the track All Night, for example, in particular, he just feels like a carbon copy of the artist that came before him. And more than that, he never feels like a carbon copy that comes from a place of admiration. Rather, he feels like a person who is taking the vocal style and general personality that is delivered on this record as being kind of an otherwise earnest and raw sound being put through a filter of pure obnoxiousness. It's just so annoying and grating. This record really is taking a great set of influences and making them as dumbed down as they possibly can. And while I'm not against that, and I do enjoy a lot of dumb music, see my collection of Butthole Surfers albums, I also feel like this is just a bit too dumb for its own good. There's nothing that makes Smith stand out as a frontman for any other reason than he's maybe a little bit crass. But even then, he's not the first person to be crass while harnessing the powers of punk, dance, disco at the same time, and he doesn't develop his presence behind the mic in any way in particular that allows him to feel like anything else other than some guy that gets kind of sloppy drunk and thinks that he's a badass, when in reality he's embarrassing himself during open mic night, and then he like pukes on stage and then plays it off cool the day after. It's really kind of secondhand embarrassing at times, even in the more serious moments that this record tries to portray. His lyrical game, too, is terrible at times. I will say this is not the kind of record that I go into expecting some Leonard Cohen-esque genius songwriting or anything like that. I recognize what this record is trying to be. I don't expect anything great from it. And as stated before, there's a solid chunk, at least, of this record that is obviously trying to do all it can to get this sort of nightclub campiness going, and it comes across as unoriginal, but nonetheless present here, and I don't really think it's the worst idea in the world. But in that sense, it feels senseless to dock What's Wrong with New York points for intentionally being mindless. Do I love that idea for it? No, absolutely not. But it still is the genuine concept of the record, and I can't really hate on an album for trying to do something that it wants to do. But what does feel worth pointing out, however, is how the record just never achieves any sort of reason to give it any sort of emotional reaction whatsoever. I mean, Smith is never introspective enough to embrace any kind of reprieve from the party culture-centric lyrics that are found here, and yet at the same time, he never takes things far enough lyrically for the album to feel truly boundary-pushing or intensely aggravating or anything like that in any particular way. The previously mentioned track Girls was somewhat controversial upon release last year, and even then I couldn't really see why. It's just a guy talking about how he likes girls and he likes to have sex with girls, and he fucks. Oh boy, does he have a lot of sex. It doesn't feel like anything special, but it's presented in this almost somewhat macho kind of way where you're meant to almost be offended by it or taken aback by it. But ultimately, there's nothing to be taken aback by here. There's just no bite to this record, despite the fact that it wears this cloak of complete and total lack of contempt, complete and total lack of awareness for anyone else around it. But in reality, it's a pretty soft record overall. It's pretty easily digestible despite it trying to put on this mirage, if you will, of intensity or a lack of, political correctness or anything like that. And what is left there with the lyrics is, in terms of impact, virtually nothing. It doesn't really help that the instrumentals here lack any interesting artistic direction as well. Again, What's Wrong with New York? It takes heavy influence from the sort of new rave scene, if you will, as well as the realm of electro clash, thus the sort of loose dance punk influences that I mentioned earlier. And although those are normally sounds that can make for some exciting music when the right people are behind it, even if it's not the most original work, it just is not really on display in any sort of intensely interesting or engaging way here on this record. It just feels nothing short of bland and uninspired, despite incorporating influences that should be the exact opposite. Some of the freshest sounds in the entire music world today are being made via the combination of punk and electronic music, thanks to a variety of bands like MS Paint and Lip Critic. But instead, what you have here with The Dare is a wildly uninteresting, somewhat of a slog, and even potentially worse slog if the runtime was longer than it was, record that doesn't manage to do anything interesting with sounds that should work. Songs like Open Up and I Destroy Disco come across as the most cookie-cutter examples of someone taking pre-existing dance music, instrumentals that sound like presets that you could get from really anywhere online, and adding a slightly gritty edge to it that doesn't even really have that much of an impact on the overall flatness of the instrumentals here. Elsewhere, the synths can often feel extremely thin and one-note, despite the fact that they are obviously trying to be emotional at certain points, especially on the back half of this record. It especially rings true for the back half of the record, actually, with songs like Elevation going for a sort of nocturnal club kind of feel, but end up coming across more as underbaked, unintentionally minimalistic, and instrumentally speaking, I just feel like there's nothing contained within What's Wrong with New York that achieves anything beyond a sort of middle-of-the-road reflection of its influences. It never really manages to elevate the various ideas that it takes and utilizes here on the record to make for an album that's actually engaging in some way. In fact, this is just an album that kind of makes me wish I was listening to the various bands and artists that it kind of knocks off throughout its track list. One could say that What's Wrong with New York is, in fact, nothing but Harrison Patrick Smith bouncing between trying to make sentimental music for the lives of drug-filled clubbers and embracing that same exact culture and lifestyle without a hint of irony and with a truckload of audacity. And both of those ideas are very interesting to me, but unfortunately, the final result, the final record that is presented to the listener here, doesn't necessarily feel like either. I mean, at the moment, The Dare, to me, is a project that is somewhere between attempting to be offensive or otherwise intense lyrically and attempting to be earnest, and it doesn't really manage to pull off either particularly well. There are brief ideas or moments here or there that seem to slightly highlight or otherwise imply what it could mean for either of those creative directions to be more fully attached to What's Wrong with New York and, in turn, The Dare as a project, but Smith never really sticks with any of those ideas for long enough for a single period of time to really drive them home in any particular way or allow them to blossom beyond their most basic forms. But then again, with a record that is plagued by spins on sounds that have been popular within alternative music for a number of decades at this point, vocal work that unabashedly manages to rip off a completely superior band, and songwriting that lacks any true identity, there may have really been no hope for this record to begin with. I mean, I do still have the slightest, and when I say slightest, I mean slightest, bit of faith that maybe Smith could turn The Dare around and turn this into a fairly interesting project that actually has something to do, something to say, some reason to exist beyond being a pretty shoddy band that seems to grab some people's attention for some reason, a pretty shoddy project, I suppose I should say. As it stands, I digress. What's Wrong with New York? It's not that turning point. In fact, it's easily the worst thing that Smith has put out as The Dare to date. Not that there's really much to add to that list, but still, this one's rough. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thanks for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.